The first sound that would cut her life in two wasn't a scream, it was the ground. The ground itself started to hum, a low, deep thrumming that vibrated up through the worn soles of her boots and into the marrow of her bones. Sarah Mitchell stopped, her hand frozen above a stubborn weed in her meager garden. The Nebraska sun was hot on her neck, the air thick with the smell of dust and sage. It was just another ordinary, hard day in 1868, until it wasn't. "Mama, I'm hungry," came a small voice from the cabin doorway. 6-year-old Thomas stood there, clutching the wooden horse his father had carved for him. He had his father's dark hair and her worried gray eyes, eyes that were growing wider by the second. Because now he heard it too. The hum was becoming a roar, a thunder without a cloud in the sky. The sound of 100 horses, maybe more, moving at a full gallop. Not the slow, tired pace of a homesteader's nag. This was the sound of war. Then came the scream. It ripped through the quiet morning from the direction of the general store, a sound so full of terror it felt like it tore the air itself. Sarah's blood went from warm to ice in a single paralyzing heartbeat. She didn't think. She just moved. She snatched Thomas from the doorway, her fingers digging into his small arm, and shoved him back inside the dim cabin. "Under the bed," she hissed, her voice a raw whisper. "Now! And you don't make a sound. You don't come out. No matter what you hear. Do you understand me, Thomas?" His eyes were huge, swallowing his face. He nodded a tiny jerky motion and scrambled into the darkness beneath their rope bed. "But Mama, go!" The word was sharper than she intended, a shard of pure fear. It was enough. He vanished. Through the single grimy window, she saw them. Warriors stripped for battle, faces a terrifying mask of red and black paint. They flowed between the crude buildings of Willow Creek like a river of death, their movements fluid and deadly. The raids had been getting worse, whispers of retaliation turning into bloody reality as the railroad tracks pushed ever deeper into their lands. Glass shattered, wood splintered, the flat crack of a rifle shot echoed, followed by another scream that was cut short. Sarah saw Mrs. Henderson, her neighbor, running. Her gray hair streamed behind her, her bonnet gone, her face a mask of disbelief. A warrior on a pinto pony overtook her in 3 effortless strides. Sarah had to look away, her stomach twisting into a knot of nausea. Her hands shaking so badly she could barely control them, reached for James's old rifle hanging above the doorframe. It was heavy, unfamiliar. She'd only ever fired it once, at a coyote. Her fingers fumbled with the lead balls and powder flask, spilling more than she loaded. She was too slow. The cabin door didn't open. It exploded inward, ripped from its leather hinges, and a nightmare stepped through the frame. 3 of them. Their eyes, hard and dark, swept the single room, missing nothing. One was older, his bare chest a road map of old scars. Another was a boy, no older than 16, but his eyes held the same cold fire. The third, the largest, carried a war club stained so dark it looked black. Sarah backed away, the useless rifle clutched to her chest like a shield. The big one grunted something in a language that sounded like rocks grinding together. He gestured at the rifle. When she remained frozen, he took 2 long strides and simply wrenched it from her hands, tossing it into the corner like a piece of firewood. And that's when it happened. From beneath the bed came the smallest, most terrified sound. A whimper, a tiny choked gasp that Thomas tried to swallow but couldn't. It was enough. The youngest warrior's head snapped toward the bed. His eyes narrowed. "No," Sarah breathed, the word a prayer. She launched herself toward the bed, a wild, protective instinct overriding all fear. "No!" Strong hands grabbed her, yanking her back with brutal force. She fought. She fought like a cornered mountain cat, kicking and scratching, a raw, animal sound tearing from her throat. The scarred warrior barked an order, and the big one slammed her face down into the dirt floor, a knee pressing into the small of her back, stealing her breath. She could only watch, her cheek pressed into the cold earth as they dragged her son from his hiding place. Thomas's eyes were wide, tears streaming silently down his dirt-streaked cheeks, but he didn't scream. Her brave, brave boy. "Take me," she tried to plead, the words a choked mess of dirt and despair. "Please, just take me. Let him go." They didn't understand, or they didn't care. The young warrior lifted Thomas as if he weighed nothing and carried him out into the chaos. Sarah's struggles became frantic, feral. The world narrowed to a single desperate need to get to her son. The scarred warrior looked down at her, his expression unreadable. It wasn't pity, it was something colder. Assessment. They bound her wrists with rawhide strips that cut into her skin until she bled. Then they hauled her to her feet and shoved her out the door into the blinding, smoke-filled sunlight. Willow Creek was burning. The general store was a roaring pyre, black smoke billowing into the pristine blue sky. Bodies lay twisted in the muddy street. She recognized the blacksmith, the store owner, a woman she'd traded eggs with just yesterday. A group of captives, mostly women and children, were being herded together like frightened cattle. Their faces were numb with shock. "Thomas!" she shrieked, her voice cracking, her eyes scanning the terrified crowd. She saw him, just for a second, a flash of dark hair. He was being lifted onto the back of a horse near the edge of the chaos. He looked small, lost. Then the horse turned, and he was gone, swallowed by the smoke and the milling warriors. They tied a rope around her neck, connecting her to the other captured women, a human chain of misery. And as they were forced to march away, Sarah looked back one last time. Behind them, Willow Creek was no longer a town. It was a funeral pyre against the prairie sky. Everything she had, everything she and James had bled and sweat for, was turning to ash. The march was a blur of pain. The sun beat down, the rope chafed her neck raw, and her thin boots were no match for the sharp rocks of the prairie. If you fell, you were dragged. If you slowed, you were prodded with the butt of a rifle. There was no mercy. By nightfall, they collapsed by a filthy stream, their bodies screaming for rest. But the ordeal wasn't over. Sarah watched in numb horror as they built up the fire, not for warmth, but for something else. They were heating pieces of metal in the flames. The other women started to weep, a low, hopeless sound. Sarah finally understood. They weren't just captives. They were about to become property. When her turn came, two warriors held her down. She didn't have the strength to fight anymore. The scarred warrior came forward, not with the branding iron, but with something else, something heavy and cold. He clamped it around her neck. It was an iron collar, crude, heavy, and final. The weight of it wasn't just physical. It was the weight of a new and terrible reality. It was the weight of a life that was no longer her own. Then came the fire. They tore her dress at the shoulder, exposing her skin. She saw the glowing symbol for a split second before it was pressed against her flesh. The pain was blinding, a white-hot agony that stole her breath and her scream. The smell of her own burning skin filled her nostrils, and the world dissolved into a swirling blackness. Her last thought, before unconsciousness claimed her, was not of herself. It was a desperate prayer sent out into the vast, uncaring darkness. "Thomas, be safe, be strong. Mama will find you." The coyotes howled, their voices a lonely lament across the plains. Sarah Mitchell of Willow Creek was gone. In her place was something else entirely, a branded thing with an iron collar, just beginning to understand that to survive this, she would have to become someone else, someone who would never ever give up. For 7 days they marched. Sarah's world became a simple, brutal equation, one foot in front of the other. The prairie gave way to rugged, broken country, a land of canyons and scrub pine that seemed to mirror the shattered pieces of her own life. The iron collar was a constant, galling weight, and the brand on her shoulder was a throbbing knot of fire. But all of it, all the physical pain, was a dull echo compared to the screaming void where Thomas should have been. On the 8th day, they arrived at the main encampment. It was a sprawling city of hide lodges nestled in a river valley, bigger than any town she had ever seen. Dogs barked, children stared with unnerving curiosity, and the air was thick with the smells of wood smoke, roasting meat, and 100 other things she couldn't name. The life of the village pulsed around them, vibrant and utterly alien. She was ripped from the line of other captives and shoved toward a lodge on the camp's edge. An old woman with eyes like chips of obsidian waited for her. The woman spat a stream of harsh words and, when Sarah didn't move fast enough, grabbed her arm with a grip like iron, and threw her to the ground. This was her new master. Her life became a litany of backbreaking chores, hauling water from the river in heavy skins, gathering firewood until her arms felt like they would pull from their sockets, scraping buffalo hides with a sharpened bone until her hands were a mass of bleeding blisters. The work started before the sun and ended long after it set. A moment of rest earned a kick. A drop bucket earned a blow. Food was a thin, greasy soup or a gnawed-on piece of dried meat, thrown to her as if she were a dog. At night, she slept on the bare ground outside the lodge with only a threadbare blanket against the growing autumn chill. She learned to keep her eyes down, to make herself small, to become a ghost. The language was a wall she couldn't climb. She was surrounded by people, yet utterly, terrifyingly alone. 3 weeks passed, 3 weeks of grinding misery and the slow death of hope. She was at the river, her muscles trembling with exhaustion, trying to fill a heavy water vessel for the fourth time that morning. The path was steep. Her foot slipped on a loose rock. The vessel flew from her grasp, tumbling down the bank and shattering against a boulder. The precious water vanished into the thirsty ground. Sarah didn't even try to get up. She just knelt there in the mud, her scraped palms stinging, and waited for the beating she knew was coming. Wasting water was a serious offense. This one would be bad. But the blow never landed. Instead, a shadow fell over her. She looked up, expecting to see the hard face of the old woman. But it wasn't her. It was a man, a young warrior, maybe 25, tall and lean. He wasn't like the others who seemed to swagger with brutal arrogance. He moved with a quiet, controlled grace. His face was unpainted, and his dark eyes held something she hadn't seen since before the raid. Curiosity. He said something, his voice low and questioning, not angry. When she could only stare back blankly, he frowned and then did something that shocked her to her core. He held out his hand. Sarah flinched. She stared at his open palm, convinced it was a trick. A new kind of cruelty she hadn't yet experienced. But his gaze was steady, patient. Hesitantly, she reached out her own trembling, mud-caked hand and placed it in his. His grip was firm but gentle as he pulled her to her feet. He glanced at her bleeding palms, then at the broken vessel. Without a word, he picked up the largest piece and gestured for her to follow. He didn't lead her back to the camp and the inevitable punishment. He led her further downriver to a spot where someone had laid flat stones to make a crude but easier path to the water's edge. He handed her his own full water skin, then turned and walked away. Sarah stood there, stunned, watching him go. It was the first act of kindness she had received in what felt like a lifetime. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his reasons. But for the first time in weeks, a tiny, fragile spark flickered to life in the darkness. She learned his name was White Crow. He was a skilled hunter, respected, but he kept to himself. She began to see him, not often, but at key moments. When her food portion was nothing but scraps, a piece of roasted rabbit would appear near her sleeping spot. When her blanket finally disintegrated, a thicker, newer one was there in its place. When a group of cruel boys began throwing stones at her, he appeared from nowhere, scattering them with a few sharp, angry words. He never spoke to her. He never looked directly at her for more than a second. But he was watching. He was protecting her in small, secret ways. Why? The question haunted her. Why would a warrior risk the scorn of his people to help a branded enemy? The moon waxed and waned. Autumn deepened. One afternoon, Sarah was gathering firewood, her back a single knot of pain. As she bent to add one last branch to her heavy basket, 3 women who took special pleasure in tormenting her appeared. They chattered amongst themselves, their laughter sharp and mocking. Then one of them deliberately kicked the basket over, scattering hours of work across the forest floor. They laughed again and strolled away. Something inside Sarah snapped. Not with a bang, but with a quiet, terrifying crack. She stared at the scattered wood, her hands clenching into fists, a scream of pure rage building in her throat. She was so tired of being less than nothing. She didn't hear him approach. His shadow fell over the wood before she saw him. White Crow. He looked from the scattered branches to her face, his expression hardening. He saw the tears of frustration she refused to let fall. He saw the tremor in her hands. This time, he didn't just observe. He knelt beside her and began to gather the wood, his movements swift and efficient. They worked in silence, and when the basket was full, he lifted it himself. It was a heavy load, but he carried it as if it were nothing. He walked her all the way back to her lodge. He made sure the three women saw him. He made sure the entire camp saw him place the basket of wood at her feet before turning and leaving without a word. The message was unmistakable. This one is protected. That night she found a small leather pouch next to her food. Inside was a salve made of herbs that smelled of pine and something else she couldn't name. She rubbed it on her raw hands on the chafed skin of her neck beneath the hateful collar. The relief was immediate, and with it came tears. Not of despair, but of a strange, aching gratitude. She didn't know it yet, but this public act of defiance had sealed both their fates. He had drawn a line in the sand. He had chosen a side. And in doing so, he had just declared war on his own people. The storm hit like a fist. One moment, the night was still and cold. The next, the sky ripped open. Rain fell in solid, blinding sheets, driven by a wind that shrieked like a banshee. Sarah huddled at the base of a large cottonwood tree, her thin blanket soaked through in seconds. The iron collar on her neck felt like it was pulling the cold deep into her bones, chilling her to the core. She was already weak. Weeks of overwork and near starvation had worn her down to almost nothing. The icy rain was stealing what little strength she had left. She began to shiver violently, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. Her legs gave out, and she slid down the muddy trunk of the tree into a puddle of freezing water. This is it, she thought with a strange sense of calm. This is how I die. Not in a raid, not by a blow, but from cold and exhaustion in a storm on the prairie. The thought of Thomas flashed through her mind, a sharp, stabbing pain. But even that was beginning to feel distant, fading away. She closed her eyes. It would be easier to just let go. Then arms, strong arms lifting her from the mud. Through the haze of encroaching darkness, she smelled wet buckskin and wood smoke. White crow. He carried her through the roaring storm, his steps sure and swift. He didn't take her to the main camp. He took her to a small, isolated lodge set apart from the others. He pushed aside the flap and carried her into the warmth. Blessed, life-giving warmth. A fire crackled in a central pit, casting dancing shadows on the hide walls. He laid her gently on a pile of thick buffalo robes, his face grim. He spoke, his voice urgent, but she couldn't make out the words over the storm's fury and the ringing in her ears. He gestured at her soaked, clinging dress. Then, with a startling gesture of respect, he turned his back. With numb, fumbling fingers, Sarah peeled off the wet rags and wrapped herself in a dry, heavy blanket he had left for her. The warmth was so intense it was almost painful. She managed a small sound, and he turned back, a wooden cup in his hand. "Drink," he said. The word was English. She stared at him, shocked, nearly dropping the cup. His English was halting, heavily accented, but it was clear. She took the cup. It was a hot, bitter tea, but it sent a wave of heat spreading through her chest. You speak English," she whispered, her own voice a hoarse croak from disuse. "Little," he said, holding his thumb and forefinger an inch apart. "From traders. Before the fighting, before the hatred, before their two worlds had collided in blood and fire." "Why?" she asked, the question she had been holding for weeks. "Why are you helping me?" He was silent for a long time, staring into the flames. "You have a child," he said at last, his voice low. "I see it in your eyes, my sister. She had the same look when the soldiers took her children to the white school, to civilize them. She died of a broken heart a year later." The words hit her harder than any physical blow. "My son," she choked out. "Thomas, he's only 6. "He live," White Crow said, his gaze meeting hers. "I have heard the talk. There is a white boy with dark hair with stone fist band. They will not kill a child. Children, they are valuable. They can be made to forget." Relief washed over her, so powerful it made her dizzy. Thomas was alive. It was the first real news, the first solid piece of hope she'd had. "Thank you," she breathed, the words inadequate. "Thank you." He gave a slight nod. You stay here tonight. You will die in the storm. They will punish you for this, she warned, taking her into his lodge, speaking to her in her own tongue. It was a violation of every rule. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. Let them. He rose as if to leave, but she reached out, her fingers just brushing the buckskin of his arm. He froze at the contact. Why? She asked again. The real reason. He turned back, and in the flickering firelight, the warrior's stoic mask slipped. She saw a profound loneliness in his eyes, a deep well of pain that mirrored her own. Because when you look at me, he said, his voice barely a whisper, you do not look with hate. Even with this, he gestured toward her collar. You do not hate. In this world, that is a rare thing. He left before she could answer, disappearing back into the raging storm. Sarah sat by the fire, his words echoing in the sudden silence of the lodge. She had thought she was alone in her cage of misery, but she realized now that White Crow was in a cage of his own. The storm passed. Morning sunlight streamed through the smoke hole of the lodge. Sarah expected to be dragged out, to face the fury of the old woman and the judgment of the camp. Instead, White Crow appeared with 2 horses. The old woman who kept you is angry, he said bluntly. She has told the chief you are useless, that you bring bad spirits. Sarah's heart sank. She knew what that meant. A useless captive was a liability, to be traded away or simply discarded. I told them I will take responsibility for you now, he continued, his face unreadable. You will work for me. You will tend my horses, mend my gear. It will be better than before. And it was. The work was still hard, but it was work she understood. Her father had been a horseman. Tending to White Crow's animals, she felt a flicker of her old self return. More than that, she was away from the constant, casual cruelty of the main camp. White Crow's lodge became a small island of civility in a sea of hostility. But the rest of the band watched. They saw. They saw her eating better food. They saw the warmer clothes she wore. They saw the way White Crow spoke to her, not as a slave, but as something else, and their suspicion curdled into open resentment. You risk too much for me, she told him one evening as they sat by the fire, repairing a saddle. They spoke in a quiet mix of English and the Dakota words she was beginning to learn. It is my choice, he replied, his eyes on his work. They whisper that you are forgetting who you are, she pressed. They say you shame your ancestors. His hand stilled. My ancestors taught me that honor is not found in cruelty. Is there honor in beating a woman who has lost everything? In branding her like cattle? His eyes met hers, and they were burning with a fire she hadn't seen before. My people have been wronged, our lands stolen, our treaties broken. But does that give us the right to become the monsters they say we are? Their nights fell into a comfortable routine. They would work, and then he would teach her a Lakota word, and she would teach him an English one. It was during one of these lessons that everything shifted. She stumbled over a word and he laughed. It was a real, unguarded sound that completely transformed his serious face. Surprised, she laughed too. For a single, breathless moment, they weren't warrior and captive. They weren't Lakota and white. They were just a man and a woman, sharing a small piece of joy in a world that had given them very little. The laughter died. The space between them crackled with an unspoken energy. He reached out, his calloused fingers tracing the cold iron of the collar at her throat. This is wrong, he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. I know, she whispered. His hand moved from the collar to cup her cheek. His touch was hesitant, gentle. Sarah found herself leaning into it, her eyes closing. How long had it been since she'd felt a kind touch? The sound of angry voices outside the lodge shattered the moment like glass. White Crow snatched his hand back as if burned. 3 warriors, their faces like stone, strode into the lodge without the courtesy of an announcement. They weren't just warriors. One of them was Stone Fist, the big, scarred man from the raid, the man whose personal mark was burned into her shoulder. He ignored Sarah completely, his eyes locked on White Crow. He spoke in rapid, guttural Lakota, his voice dripping with contempt. Sarah couldn't understand all of it, but she caught enough. Words like shame, white woman, and traitor. He pointed a finger at her, then jabbed it toward White Crow's chest. It was a clear accusation, a direct challenge. White Crow listened, his body rigid, his face a mask of cold fury. He replied in a low-level tone that was somehow more menacing than a shout. Whatever he said, it was the wrong thing. Stonefist's eyes narrowed to slits. He gave Sarah a long, slow look, a look of ownership and threat, before turning and leaving with the other two warriors. A heavy silence descended on the lodge. "What did he say?" Sarah finally asked, her voice trembling. White Crow stared into the fire, his hands clenched into fists. "He says the council grows tired of my games. He says a decision has been made." He finally looked at her, and the despair in his eyes terrified her. "They have given you to him," he said, his voice flat and dead. "As of sunrise, you are the property of Stone Fist." The words hung in the air, a death sentence. Stone Fist, the brutal warrior who led the raid on her home, the man whose gaze made her skin crawl. The thought of being his property was worse than death. It was a descent into a hell she couldn't even imagine. "No," Sarah whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "You can't let them." "I have no choice!" White Crow exploded, slamming his fist against the lodge pole. The raw violence of the motion shocked her. "I went to the chief. I argued. But Stone Fist has the council's ear. He tells them I am weak, that my heart has been softened by a white woman. He says I am a danger to our people, a traitor." He began to pace the small lodge like a caged wolf. "They see you, and they see the railroad, the soldiers, the broken promises. Stone Fist uses their fear, their anger. He twists it. Then let me go," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Just let me run. I'll take my chances on the prairie. It's better than—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "You would not last a day," he said, stopping to face her. The anger in his eyes was replaced by a desperate intensity. "And he would hunt you, for sport." He took a deep breath, his decision hardening his features. "There is only one path left for us." "What path?" "We leave. Tonight. Together." The idea was insane. A lone warrior and a white captive, fleeing into the vast, unforgiving wilderness, with winter approaching. They would be hunted not just by Stone Fist, but by the entire band. It was suicide. "And my son?" she asked, the words tearing at her throat. "Thomas is with his band. If we run, I'll never find him." This was the moment White Crow's plan came into focus, and Sarah realized his kindness was never just pity. It was part of something deeper, something far more dangerous. "Finding your son is the reason we must run," he said, his voice dropping to a low, urgent whisper. "Stone Fist doesn't just want you, Sarah. He wants what your husband knew." Sarah stared at him, confused. "James? What are you talking about? My husband was a farmer." "He was more than that," White Crow corrected her. "Before he settled in Willow Creek, he was a surveyor for the railroad. He mapped this territory. He knew the hidden passes, the secret water holes, and the location of something Stone Fist has been searching for years." He unrolled a small piece of buckskin he pulled from his parfleche bag. On it were crude drawings, a river, a series of hills, and a specific, strangely shaped rock formation. "My brother, he was friends with your James. They believed peace was possible. They met in secret. My brother told me James had found something, a place the whites call the Lost Spanish Mine, and a place full of gold." The raid on Willow Creek suddenly snapped into horrifying focus. It wasn't random. "They weren't just raiding," Sarah breathed. "They were looking for James's maps." "Yes. And when they didn't find them, Stone Fist took the next best thing. The one person who might know where they are hidden." "Me?" Sarah shook her head. "I don't know anything about a mine." "He doesn't believe that," White Crow said grimly. "And he took your son for the same reason. He thinks you will trade the location for the boy's life. Thomas is not just a captive, Sarah. He is leverage." The world tilted on its axis. Her son wasn't just lost. He was a pawn in a deadly game she never even knew she was playing. The cruelty was staggering, a calculated evil that left her breathless. "We will not run blindly," White Crow continued, his voice steady and confident again. I know where Stonefist keeps his band. It is a 3-day ride from here, in the shadow of the Black Hills. We will go there. We will get your son, and then we will disappear into the mountains where they will never find us. His plan was born of desperation, a wild gamble against impossible odds. But for the first time since the raid, Sarah felt a surge of something other than fear. It was a cold, hard rage. They had taken her home, her freedom, and her son. They had underestimated her. They thought she was a broken, helpless captive. They were wrong. "What do we need?" she asked, her voice devoid of its earlier tremor. It was the voice of a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. A slow smile touched White Crow's lips. "Good," he said. "The woman I saw in the storm is back." They moved like ghosts in the pre-dawn darkness. White Crow had gathered supplies, dried meat, a water skin, blankets, and most importantly, weapons. He handed Sarah a knife, its bone handle smooth and cool in her palm. For himself, he had his bow and a quiver of arrows, and a rifle he had taken from a soldier long ago. He led 2 of his best horses, a strong bay and a swift pinto, to a secluded grove away from the sleeping camp. Every rustle of leaves, every distant dog bark, sent a jolt of adrenaline through Sarah's veins. "The collar," she said, her fingers touching the cold iron. "They will be able to track us. This marks me." "We will deal with it when we are clear," he said. "For now we ride." He helped her onto the pinto, then swung himself onto the bay. For a moment they just sat there, 2 fugitives outlined against the star-dusted sky, listening to the sounds of the sleeping enemy all around them. Then with a soft click of his tongue, White Crow urged his horse forward, and they melted into the shadows. They rode hard, pushing the horses through the broken country, keeping to the ravines and wooded areas where they were less likely to be seen. The sun rose, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, but it brought no warmth, only the fear of exposure. Every rock formation, every distant shape, looked like a pursuing warrior. By midday, they stopped in a hidden canyon to rest the horses and drink from a small, clear spring. The silence was immense, broken only by the wind and the chuffing of the horses. "Now the collar," White Crow said, his face serious. He pulled a small, flat rock and a heavy stone from his pack. "There is no key. It must be broken." Sarah knelt, her heart pounding. She laid her head on a large, smooth boulder, exposing the thick iron ring. "Do it," she whispered. White Crow positioned the flat rock against the hinge of the collar. "Do not move," he commanded. He raised the heavy stone. "Eat tit." Sarah closed her eyes, bracing herself. The sound of the stone striking the rock was deafeningly loud in the quiet canyon. It sent a jarring shock through her skull. Once, twice. On the 3rd strike, there was a sharp crack. The pressure on her neck was gone. She reached up, her fingers tracing the raw, chafed skin where the collar had been for months. She was free of it. The symbol of her bondage was broken, lying in 2 pieces on the ground. She felt a sob of pure relief rise in her chest. White Crow kicked the pieces of iron under a bush. "There," he said. "You are Sarah Mitchell again." But their relief was short-lived. As he stood up, his eyes scanned the rim of the canyon. He suddenly froze, his body going rigid. "What is it?" Sarah asked, scrambling to her feet. He didn't answer. He just pointed. High above them, on the edge of the canyon wall, a lone figure on horseback was silhouetted against the bright blue sky. A watcher. They had been found already. And then the watcher raised a hand, and from over the ridge, 3 more riders appeared. "Stone Fist!" White Crow breathed, his voice a low curse. "He didn't wait until sunrise. He must have known." There was no time to think. They scrambled for the horses. Arrows hissed past them, thudding into the ground where they had been standing just seconds before. A war cry echoed down the canyon walls, a sound that chilled Sarah to the bone. They leaped onto their horses, White Crow firing an arrow back toward their pursuers as they galloped away. They raced down the narrow canyon, the walls a blur on either side, the thunder of hoofbeats, theirs and their hunters, reverberating around them. The canyon opened up onto a wide, flat plain. It was a death trap. Nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. Stone Fist and his warriors were gaining, their horses fresh. Sarah risked a look back. They were closer now, close enough for her to see the cruel, triumphant smile on Stonefist's face. "We can't outrun them!" she shouted over the wind. "We don't have to!" White Crow yelled back. He pointed ahead. "There! The river!" A wide, fast-moving river snaked across the plain ahead of them. The current was strong, the water churning and white in places. It looked impassable. "We'll never make it across." "We go in it, not across it," he commanded. "Follow me. Do exactly as I do." He urged his horse straight toward the riverbank, not slowing down. Just before they reached the water's edge, he veered sharply to the right, plunging down a steep, hidden bank and into the shallows. The water was cold, shocking her legs, but the high bank provided cover. They galloped along the edge of the river, hidden from the view of their pursuers on the plain above. The arrows stopped. The war cries faded. They rode for what felt like miles, the horses splashing through the knee-deep water, until White Crow finally slowed, guiding them out of the river and into a thick stand of cottonwood trees. They were shaking, soaked, and exhausted, but they were alive, and for the moment they were safe. "He'll expect us to keep heading west, toward the mountains," White Crow said, his chest heaving as he fought to catch his breath. "He will send riders to cut us off, so we will not go west." "Where do we go?" Sarah asked. He looked north, his eyes narrowed in calculation. "We go north, directly into the heart of his territory. He will never expect us to run toward him. We will circle around and come at his camp from behind." It was a bold, reckless plan. The kind of plan that could only be conceived by a man with nothing to lose. It was their only chance. As night fell, they made a cold camp, with no fire to betray their position. Huddled together for warmth under a shared blanket, Sarah found herself studying White Crow's face in the faint moonlight. He was more than the kind warrior who had saved her. He was a brilliant strategist, a fierce fighter, and he was risking everything. His life, his soul, for her and her son. "White Crow," she whispered his name. He turned to look at her, his eyes dark pools in the dim light. "My husband James, he told me once that if anything ever happened to him, there was a place, a small box hidden under a hearthstone in our cabin." Her voice was barely audible. "He said everything that mattered was in that box." White Crow's eyes widened slightly. "The maps?" "I think so," she said. "Stone Fist burned my home to the ground, but a hearthstone, that might survive a fire." A new, dangerous piece had just been added to the board. The maps to a fortune in gold were likely sitting in the ashes of Willow Creek, and Stonefist was the kind of man who would tear the world apart to find them. This wasn't just about Thomas anymore. It was about a secret that could get them all killed. "We get Thomas first," White Crow said, his voice firm, resolute. "Then we worry about maps and gold." But Sarah knew it wasn't that simple. As long as those maps existed, as long as Stonefist believed she knew their location, he would never ever stop hunting them. The next 2 days were a tense, exhausting blur. They traveled north, deeper into the territory controlled by Stonefist's people, a land of rolling hills and sparse, windswept plains. They moved at night and hid during the day, conserving the strength of their horses and themselves. The constant fear of discovery was a knot in Sarah's stomach. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a pursuing rider. During the long hours of hiding, they talked. Sarah told him about her life in Ohio, about meeting James, about their dream of building a life on the frontier. White Crow, in turn, told her about his. He spoke of his brother's wisdom, his sister's kindness, and the growing darkness he saw in men like Stone Fist, who valued power and vengeance above honor and tradition. They were from different worlds, born to be enemies, but huddled in the cold wilderness. They found a common ground in their shared losses and their desperate hope for a future. The bond between them deepened, no longer just captor and captive, protector and protected. It was something more, something fragile and unnamed that they were both too afraid to acknowledge. On the evening of the third day, they reached a high ridge overlooking a narrow valley. Below them, nestled by a creek, was Stone Fist's camp. It was smaller than the main encampment, maybe 20 lodges in all, but heavily guarded. Warriors patrolled the perimeter, their silhouettes stark against the setting sun. "He's there," White Crow said, pointing to a large lodge in the center of the camp, decorated with painted symbols of battle. That is Stonefist's lodge, and the one next to it, that is where they will be keeping the boy. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Thomas was down there, so close. She could feel him, a mother's instinct that transcended distance. She had to fight the overwhelming urge to just run down the hill, screaming his name. "How do we get to him?" she whispered, her eyes scanning the fortified camp. "It's impossible." "Nothing is impossible," White Crow said, a grim determination in his voice. "Tonight, there is a new moon. The darkness will be our ally. They will not expect an attack from within their own territory. Their guards will be watching the south where they think we are." He laid out the plan, his voice low and precise. They would wait until the deepest part of the night, when the camp was asleep. He would create a diversion on the far side of the camp. A fire, a stampede of the horse herd. In the chaos, Sarah's job was to slip into the lodge, get Thomas and meet him at a designated spot on the other side of the valley. It was a plan with 1,000 ways to go wrong. "You want me to go in alone?" she asked, her fear a cold lump in her throat. "They are looking for a warrior. They will not be looking for a woman," he explained. "You can move through the shadows in a way I cannot. You belonged in these camps. You know how to be invisible." He placed his hands on her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "You can do this, Sarah. You are stronger than you know." His belief in her was a palpable force, pushing back her fear. She nodded, her resolve hardening. "I can do this." They waited. The hours crawled by, each one an eternity. The camp below grew quiet as fires died down to embers, and the last voices faded into silence. The sky was a black, moonless void, the stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Finally, White Crow squeezed her arm. "It is time." He gave her the knife. "Do not hesitate to use this," he said, his eyes boring into hers. Then he slipped away, a shadow moving through other shadows, circling around toward the horse herd. Sarah was alone. She took a deep breath, clutching the knife, and began to make her way down the steep, rocky hillside. She moved slowly, carefully, placing each foot with painstaking precision. The camp was silent, an eerie collection of dark, sleeping shapes. She reached the edge of the camp and slipped between two lodges, her heart pounding so loud she was sure someone would hear it. She kept to the deepest shadows, her movements fluid, her mind focused on one thing: the lodge next to Stonefist's. It was just ahead. 20 more steps. 10. 5. She reached the hide flap of the door. Her hand was trembling so hard she could barely grasp it. She took another shaky breath and slowly, silently, lifted the flap and slipped inside. The lodge was dark, the air thick with the smell of sleep. A small fire pit in the center held only a few faintly glowing embers. By their dim red light, she could make out two figures sleeping on buffalo robes. An old woman, her guard, and a small boy, curled into a tight ball. Thomas. Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to cry, to scoop him up in her arms, but she couldn't. Not yet. She crept forward, her bare feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth. She reached his side and knelt down, gently shaking his shoulder. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Thomas, wake up. It's Mama." His eyes fluttered open. For a moment there was confusion, then recognition dawned, wide and wondrous. "Mama?" he whispered, his voice full of sleep. "Shh," she said, pressing a finger to his lips. "We have to be very, very quiet." Suddenly, on the far side of the camp, a shout rang out, then another, then the terrified whinnying of horses and the sound of 100 thundering hooves. The diversion. White Crow. The old woman guarding Thomas shot up from her sleeping robe, her eyes wide with alarm. She saw Sarah. For a split second they stared at each other. Then the woman opened her mouth to scream. Sarah didn't think. She reacted. She lunged forward, not with the knife, but with her free hand, clamping it hard over the woman's mouth. With her other arm she scooped up a stunned Thomas, pulling him close. The woman fought, biting at her hand, but Sarah held on, her adrenaline-fueled strength surprising even herself. "Run, Thomas!" she hissed, shoving him toward the lodge flap. "Run to the trees!" He hesitated for a second, then obeyed, scrambling out into the chaotic night. The old woman twisted, sinking her teeth deep into the flesh of Sarah's hand. Sarah cried out in pain, her grip faltering. The woman took a deep breath, ready to sound the alarm that would bring the entire camp down on them. Then a shadow filled the doorway. It wasn't White Crow, it was Stone Fist. He stood there, a towering silhouette against the growing light of the fire from the far side of the camp. His eyes, burning with rage, locked onto hers. He didn't say a word. He just smiled, a cold, terrifying smile that promised a world of pain. The old woman saw him and fell silent, scrambling away. Sarah was trapped. Stone Fist took a slow step into the lodge, then another, blocking her only escape. "You have been a great deal of trouble," he said in perfect, unaccented English. The shock of it was like a physical blow, staggering her. All this time, the warrior who had destroyed her life, who she thought of as a savage, spoke her language as well as she did. The deception was profound. "But the chase is over," he continued, his smile widening. "Now, you will tell me where your husband hid his maps." The camp was in an uproar behind him, shouts and confusion echoing through the valley. But in the small lodge, there was only a deadly silence. Sarah stood her ground, the small knife clutched in her hand, her mind racing. Thomas was out there, alone in the dark. White Crow was waiting. "I don't know what you're talking about," she lied, her voice shaking but firm. Stonefist laughed, a low, ugly sound. "Oh, I think you do, and I have many ways of making you remember." He took another step, and Sarah knew this was it. He wasn't going to capture her. He was going to break her. Right here, right now. She raised the knife, the small blade looking pathetic against his massive frame. Suddenly, an arrow whistled through the lodge opening and embedded itself deep in Stonefist's shoulder. He roared in pain and fury, staggering back, clutching at the feathered shaft. He spun around to face the doorway. White Crow stood there, his bow still raised, another arrow already knocked on the string. His face was a mask of cold, deadly intent. "Let her go, Stonefist," he commanded, his Lakota sharp and clear. "This is between you and me." Stonefist ripped the arrow from his shoulder with a guttural scream, blood pouring down his arm. He ignored the wound. "Traitor!" he spat. "You would die for this white dog?" "I would die for honor," White Crow replied. "Something you know nothing about." In that moment, Sarah saw her chance. While the two warriors were locked in their standoff, she bolted. She ducked under Stonefist's bleeding arm and scrambled out of the lodge into the pandemonium. Warriors were running everywhere, some toward the stampeding horses, others toward the commotion at their leader's lodge. "Thomas!" she screamed, her eyes scanning the darkness. "Mama!" A small voice answered from the edge of the creek. She ran, ignoring the shouts behind her. She saw him, a small, terrified shape huddled behind a willow tree. She scooped him up, holding him so tight he grunted. "It's okay, baby. It's okay. Mama's here." The roar of a rifle split the night, deafeningly close. Sarah flinched, shielding Thomas with her body. When she looked back, she saw White Crow staggering, clutching his side. Stonefist stood over him, the smoking rifle in his hand, a look of triumph on his face. He had disarmed White Crow and now stood ready to deliver the final blow. "No!" Sarah screamed. She couldn't leave him. Not after everything. She put Thomas down. "Stay here. Do not move," she commanded, her voice fierce. Before she knew what she was doing, she was running back toward the lodge, the knife still in her hand. Stonefist saw her coming. He laughed, amused by her foolish courage. He turned from the wounded White Crow to face her, raising the rifle to use it as a club. He was so focused on her, so consumed by his victory, that he never saw it coming. White Crow, lying on the ground, his side a mess of blood, wasn't finished. With a final, desperate surge of strength, he pulled the knife from his own belt and threw it. The blade spun end over end, catching the firelight, and buried itself to the hilt in the back of Stonefist's leg. Stonefist screamed, a sound of agony and surprise, and his leg buckled. He stumbled, his balance gone. And that single moment of weakness was all Sarah needed. She didn't hesitate. She threw herself forward, driving her own small knife with all her strength, all her rage, all her pain, into Stone Fist's exposed side. The big warrior gasped, his eyes wide with shock. He looked down at the knife handle protruding from his ribs, then up at her face, a look of utter disbelief on his features. He tried to speak, but only a bloody gurgle came out. He staggered back, his legs gave way, and he collapsed to the ground, his reign of terror finally over. The camp fell silent. The warriors who had been running toward the fight stopped dead, staring at the scene. Their invincible leader, the great Stone Fist, lay dead at the feet of a captive white woman. Sarah stood there panting, covered in dirt and blood, the knife still clutched in her hand. She looked at White Crow, who was struggling to sit up, his face pale with pain. Their eyes met across the space between them, and in that look, 1,000 unspoken words were exchanged. Then from the edge of the circle of stunned warriors, a new figure emerged. It was Chief Standing Bear, the old leader from the main camp, flanked by a dozen of his own men. They must have been tracking them, but had arrived to witness a scene they could never have imagined. The chief's eyes took in the dead Stone Fist, the wounded White Crow, and the defiant woman standing over the body of her tormentor. He looked at Sarah, and for the first time, he didn't see a captive. He saw a warrior. His gaze shifted to White Crow, and it was filled with a complex mixture of anger, respect, and regret. He barked an order, and 2 of his warriors moved to help White Crow, lifting him carefully. Standing Bear walked over to where Sarah stood. He looked at the body of Stone Fist, then back at her. He spoke not to her, but to his men, his voice ringing with authority through the silent camp. White Crow, leaning heavily on the 2 warriors, translated for her, his voice weak. He says, Stone Fist's heart was black. He says he led our people down a dark path of vengeance. He says you have the heart of a she-bear fighting for her cub, a spirit worthy of respect. The chief then looked directly at Sarah and spoke one word in English, a word she never thought she would hear. Free? Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she ran back to the creek, to the small boy who was her entire world. She fell to her knees and pulled Thomas into her arms, burying her face in his hair, her body shaking with sobs of grief, relief, and an exhaustion so profound it felt like it went down to her soul. She had done it. She had faced the monster and won. She had her son back. The journey back was nothing like the one before. They traveled with the chief's party, not as captives, but as something else. Honored guests almost. White Crow's wound was deep but not fatal. Sarah, using a knowledge of herbs her mother had taught her, tended to it daily. During the slow, quiet days of travel, the silence between them was no longer one of necessity, but of deep, unspoken understanding. When they reached the main encampment, the news of Stone Fist's death had preceded them. The mood was somber, but not one of grief. It was one of change, of a turning point. Chief Standing Bear summoned Sarah to his lodge. White Crow, his arm in a sling, came with her to translate. The man you killed was a disease in our tribe, the chief said, his old eyes wise and sad. But his actions have consequences. His followers will seek vengeance. It is no longer safe for you here. And White Crow, he has chosen a path that sets him apart from his people. He can no longer stay with us either. He offered them supplies, horses, and a head start. Go west, he advised, to the mountains. Find a new life where the names Stone Fist and White Crow are not known. That afternoon, they found themselves standing at the edge of the encampment where she had once been a slave. 2 horses were packed with supplies. Thomas, holding her hand tightly, looked back at the village that had been his prison. Where are we going, Mama? He asked. Sarah looked at White Crow, who was staring out at the vast prairie. His people were behind him, his future uncertain. He had lost his place in the world for her. We're going home, Thomas, she said softly. We're going to find a new one. White Crow turned to her, a small, sad smile on his lips. There is still the matter of the map, he said. The gold. Sarah thought of the hearthstone and the ashes of her cabin. She thought of the life of fear and greed that gold would bring. She thought of Stone Fist and how his lust for it had twisted him into a monster. Let it stay buried, she said, her voice clear and certain. Some things are worth more than gold. He nodded, his eyes showing his relief. He had been testing her, she realized, and she had given the right answer. They mounted their horses, Sarah pulling Thomas up to ride in front of her. They didn't look back. They rode west toward the setting sun, two survivors from different worlds, bound together by tragedy and courage. A woman who had rediscovered her strength, a man who had redefined his honor, and a small boy who was the future they would build together. The path ahead was unknown. They had no home, no destination, only a shared will to live, to be free. And as the vast, empty prairie swallowed them up, Sarah knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that they would make it. Together, they were strong enough to build a new world out of the ashes of the old one. They were survivors, and their story was just beginning. If you were moved by Sarah's incredible story of courage and survival, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You never know what stories are waiting to be uncovered in the shadows of history, and let me know in the comments below. What do you think was the bravest thing Sarah did? Until next time, stay safe out there.